John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was an English writer and philologist best known for his high fantasy works, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings. He taught Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University from 1925 to 1945 and later English language and literature until his retirement in 1959. A close friend of C.S. Lewis, he was part of the literary group, The Inklings, and was awarded a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1972 by Queen Elizabeth II. After Tolkien passed away, his son Christopher released multiple works from his father's notes and unpublished manuscripts, including The Silmarillion, which combined with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, form a comprehensive collection of tales, poems, made-up histories, artificial languages, and literary essays about a fantasy realm named Arda and its central area, Middle-earth. From 1951 to 1955, Tolkien referred to the bulk of these writings as his legendarium. Before Tolkien, many other authors had written fantasy, but the immense success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings brought about a resurgence in popularity of the genre and earned Tolkien the title of the father of modern high fantasy literature. J.R.R. Tolkien's forefathers were middle-class artisans who sold clocks, watches, and pianos in London and Birmingham. The family originated from Kreuzberg, East Prussia, where Tolkien's earliest known ancestor Mitchell was born around 1620. Michael's son Christianus was a wealthy miller in Kreuzberg, and his two grandsons, Daniel and John, emigrated to London in the 1770s and started the London-based Gravel and Tolkien clock and watch manufacture. Some other German relatives joined the two brothers in London. The Tolkien surname is of Low Prussian origin, meaning son, descendant of Tolk. Despite believing his name derived from the German word foolhardy, J.R.R. Tolkien was aware of his family's German origin, but limited knowledge due to being early isolated from the family of his prematurely deceased father. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on January 3, 1892, in Bloemfontein, Orange Free State, now Free State Province in South Africa, to English bank manager Arthur Reuel Tolkien and his wife Mabel. The family had moved there due to Arthur's job promotion. Tolkien had a younger brother, Hilary, born in 1894. As a child, Tolkien was bitten by a baboon spider in the garden, an event that some say inspired his stories. He went to England with his family at age 3, but his father died before they could reunite, leaving the family without an income. They moved to Birmingham to live with Tolkien's grandparents and later to Sarehole, where he spent much of his childhood exploring and being inspired by the local scenery, including hills, towns, and villages, which would later appear in his books. The name, Bag End, came from his aunt's farm and was used in his fiction. As a child, Tolkien's mother taught him and his younger brother at home. Ronald, as he was known, was an eager student and showed a particular interest in botany, which his mother nurtured. He had a passion for drawing landscapes and trees, but his favorite subject was language, and his mother taught him the basics of Latin at a young age. By the age of 4, Tolkien was able to read, and soon after, he could write fluently. His mother encouraged him to read many books, but he didn't like Treasure Island, The Pied Piper, or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. He enjoyed stories about Native Americans and works of fantasy by George MacDonald, and the fairy books of Andrew Lang had a significant impact on him, which is evident in some of his later writings. Mabel Tolkien converted to Catholicism in 1900, despite opposition from her Baptist family, which cut off financial support. In 1904, when J.R.R. Tolkien was 12, his mother passed away from untreated type 1 diabetes at 34 years old. Tolkien later wrote, "My mother was a true martyr, and not everyone is blessed with a mother who worked tirelessly to ensure her children kept the faith, even if it led to her early death." Prior to her passing, Mabel Tolkien appointed Father Francis Xavier Morgan of the Birmingham Oratory as the guardian of her sons and instructed him to raise them as devout Catholics. Father Francis, who was referred to as Father Francis by J.R.R. Tolkien, had a significant impact on the author's life. In a 1965 letter to his son Michael, Tolkien described Father Francis as a Welsh Spaniard Tory who was perceived as a gossiping old man by some but was, in reality, a source of charity and forgiveness. He taught Tolkien the values of these qualities and helped him to understand the mother of Jesus better than Bloody Mary. After the death of his mother, J.R.R. Tolkien was raised in Edgbaston, Birmingham and attended King Edward's School, then St. Philip's School. He received a foundation scholarship in 1903 and went back to King Edward's. In his teenage years, Tolkien was introduced to a constructed language called Animalic by his cousins, Mary and Marjorie Incledon. At the time, he was studying Latin and Anglo-Saxon. Although Mary and Marjorie's interest in Animalic faded, Tolkien and others, including Mary, created a new and more complex language called Nevbosh. Later, Tolkien created his own constructed language called Nefaran. He learned Esperanto before 1909 and wrote his earliest invented alphabet in a notebook called The Book of the Foxrook. Some texts in the notebook were written in Esperanto. In 1911, Tolkien and 3 friends formed a semi-secret society at King Edward's School called the TCBS, Tea Club and Barrovian Society, reflecting their love of drinking tea at Barrow's stores near the school and secretly in the school library. After graduation, the members remained in touch and, in December 1914, they held a council in London at Wiseman's home. This meeting strengthened Tolkien's commitment to writing poetry. In 1911, during a summer trip to Switzerland, Tolkien was inspired to base Bilbo's journey across the Misty Mountains on his own experiences. The group of 12 hiked from Interlaken to Lauterbrunnen and beyond, and the memories of the beautiful view stayed with Tolkien for the rest of his life. Later in 1911, he enrolled at Exeter College, Oxford, where he studied classics before switching to English language and literature. He graduated in 1915 with top honors, and had a tutor named Joseph Wright who had influenced him as a young student with his book on the Gothic language. Tolkien met Edith Bratt, who was 3 years his senior, when he was 16 and living in a boarding house where she also lived. The two began a romance and would often sit in Birmingham tea shops throwing sugar into the hats of passersby. However, Father Morgan, who was assigned to raise Tolkien and his brother, did not approve of the relationship as Edith was older and Protestant. He forbade them from communicating until Tolkien was 21, and threatened to end his university career if he did not comply. Despite these restrictions, Tolkien followed the prohibition except for one instance. In 1913, on the evening of his 21st birthday, Tolkien wrote a letter to Edith, who was staying with a family friend in Cheltenham, confessing his love for her and proposing marriage. Edith had already accepted a proposal from another man, but after a heart-to-heart talk with Tolkien and reconsidering her feelings, she returned the engagement ring and agreed to marry him. The news caused upset and anger from the other man's family, and Edith's guardian expressed concern about Tolkien's poor financial prospects. After their engagement, Edith agreed to convert to Catholicism, which caused tension with her guardian who was anti-Catholic. Despite the opposition, Edith and Ronald were married at St. Mary Immaculate Catholic Church in Warwick on March 22, 1916. In a letter to Michael in 1941, Tolkien praised his wife's decision to marry him despite his lack of job, finances, and uncertain future due to the Great War. In August 1914, the UK entered World War I despite pressure from others. Tolkien chose not to enlist right away. Instead, he delayed enlistment until he completed his degree, which he did in July 1915. He was then commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers. He trained for 11 months before being posted to France. The night before his departure, he and his wife spent the night at a hotel in Birmingham. Tolkien wrote that leaving his wife was like a death. On June 5, 1916, Tolkien joined the British Expeditionary Forces base depot at Étaples and was assigned as a signals officer to the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers Battalion. To pass time, he wrote a poem called The Lonely Isle, and used a code of dots to communicate with Edith and evade the British Army's censorship. He joined his unit near Amiens on June 27 and was in charge of enlisted men from Lancashire's mining, milling, and weaving towns. Despite feeling a connection to these men, military protocol prohibited friendship and required him to discipline and train them, which he considered an improper job for any man. Tolkien reached the Somme in early July 1916 and took part in the assaults on the Schwaben Redoubt and the Leipzig salient while stationed behind the lines at Bouzincourt. His wife, Edith, was under immense stress, fearing that every knock at the door could bring news of her husband's death. She monitored his movements on the Western Front using a map. The Lancashire Fusiliers Anglican chaplain, Reverend Mervyn S. Evers, noted that Tolkien and his fellow officers were plagued by lice, which were immune to the medical officer's ointment. On October 27, 1916, during an attack on Regina Trench, Tolkien contracted trench fever, a disease spread by lice, and was sent back to England on November 8, 1916. Many of Tolkien's close school friends were killed in the war, including Rob Gilson and Geoffrey Smith, both members of the Tea Club and Barrovian Society. After his return to England, Tolkien's battalion was nearly decimated. Tolkien was thankful for his experience in Kitchener's army, which brought people from all social backgrounds together and taught him empathy for the plain soldier from the agricultural counties. Tolkien was discharged from the army on November 3, 1920, as a lieutenant. He then worked on the Oxford English Dictionary, focused on words of Germanic origin starting with W in 1920. He became a reader in English language at the University of Leeds, the youngest staff member there. He wrote a Middle English vocabulary, edited Sir Gawain and the Green Knight with E.V. Gordon, and translated Sir Gawain, Pearl, and Sir Orfeo while at Leeds. In 1925, he became Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford with a fellowship at Pembroke College. From mid-1919, he privately tutored undergraduates at Lady Margaret Hall and St. Hugh's College, as women's colleges needed good teachers and married professors like him were deemed suitable, unlike Bachelor Don. While at Pembroke College, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and the first 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings while living at 20 Northmoor Road in North Oxford. In 1932, he also published a philological essay on the name, Nodens, after Sir Mortimer Wheeler uncovered a Roman Asclepion at Lydney Park, Gloucestershire in 1928. In the 1920s, Tolkien translated Beowulf, completing it in 1926 but not publishing it until 2014, over 40 years after his death and nearly 90 years after its completion. In 1936, he delivered a highly regarded lecture on the work, Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, which permanently impacted Beowulf research. This lecture challenged the then dominant view that Beowulf was a childish poem about battles with monsters and instead argued that the author was addressing universal human destiny and the monsters were crucial to the poem. Tolkien emphasized the poem's poetic nature over its linguistic elements, and expressed his high regard for Beowulf, which was evident in his Middle-earth legendarium. According to Carpenter, Tolkien began his Beowulf lectures dramatically by entering the room in silence, fixing the audience with a look, and suddenly reciting the poem's opening lines in Old English, making students realize its power as dramatic poetry. Auden later wrote to Tolkien, thanking him for the unforgettable experience of hearing him recite Beowulf, describing the voice as the voice of Gandalf. Before World War II, Tolkien was selected as a codebreaker. In January 1939, he was asked to serve in the Foreign Office's cryptographic department in the event of national emergency. He took a training course in London starting in March 27. He was informed in October that he wouldn't be needed. In 1945, he became the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature at Merton College, Oxford, where he stayed until retiring in 1959. He was an external examiner for University College, Galway for many years and received an honorary degree from the National University of Ireland in 1954. He finished writing The Lord of the Rings in 1948 after nearly 10 years of work. The Tolkiens had 4 children, John, Michael, Christopher, and Priscilla. Tolkien was affectionate towards his children and created illustrated letters from Father Christmas for them during their childhood. During the last 14 years of his life, from 1959 until his death in 1973, Tolkien's popularity and literary fame steadily rose. His friend C.S. Lewis even nominated him for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1961. The sales of his books were so successful that he regretfully realized he should have retired earlier. In a 1972 letter, Tolkien expressed discomfort with his cult-like status but acknowledged that even a modest idol's nose can't remain untouched by the sweet aroma of incense. Fan attention became overwhelming, forcing Tolkien to remove his phone number from the public directory. He and Edith eventually moved to Bournemouth, a seaside resort popular among British upper middle class. Their status as best-selling authors allowed them to easily enter polite society, but Tolkien missed the company of his fellow Inklings. Edith, on the other hand, was delighted to host society events, which was one of the reasons for their move to Bournemouth. Despite their differing personalities, Ronald and Edith's affection for each other was evident in their care for each other's health, in the way they presented gifts, in Ronald's sacrifice of his Oxford life for Edith's happiness in Bournemouth, and in her pride in his literary success. Their love was also evident in their shared love for their children and grandchildren. In his retirement, Tolkien served as a consultant and translator for the 1966 publication of the Jerusalem Bible. Initially assigned a larger portion to translate, due to other commitments, he only provided criticism of other contributors' work and translated the Book of Jonah. After Edith passed away in November 1971, Ronald moved back to Oxford and was given rooms at Merton College near the High Street. He missed Edith but enjoyed being back in the city. In 1972, he was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire and received the insignia at Buckingham Palace. That same year, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters from Oxford University. Ronald had the name, Luthien, engraved on Edith's tombstone at Wolvercote Cemetery in Oxford. When he died 21 months later from a bleeding ulcer and chest infection, he was buried next to Edith with Baron added to his name. His estate was valued at £190,577 in 1973. Tolkien's Middle-earth books, particularly The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, drew inspiration from a range of sources including language study, Christianity, medieval culture, mythology, archaeology, literature, and personal experiences. He was particularly interested in Old English literature, especially Beowulf, and the influence of Germanic, Celtic, Finnish, and Greek language and mythology. The works of William Morris and authors such as John Buchan and H. Rider Haggard also impacted Tolkien. His childhood in the rural English countryside and its eventual urbanization by Birmingham's growth influenced his creation of the Shire, while his time fighting in World War I trenches shaped his depiction of Mordor. Tolkien's books on Middle-earth, particularly The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, were not intended to be popular. However, in 1936, Susan Dagnall, a worker at George Allen and Unwin Publishing in London, discovered The Hobbit and convinced Tolkien to publish it. The book was a hit among both children and adults and was successful enough for the publishers to request a follow-up. Tolkien's request for a sequel led to the creation of his most famous work, The Lord of the Rings, which was published in 3 volumes between 1954 and 1955. He spent over a decade writing the story and its appendices, with support from the Inklings, especially his friend C.S. Lewis. Originally intended as a children's tale like The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings became darker and more serious as it was written, drawing on Tolkien's extensive backstory for Beleriand, later published in The Silmarillion. The book greatly impacted the fantasy genre and remains a popular work of the 20th century, named the UK's best-loved novel in the 2003 BBC Big Read survey, My Favourite Book in Australia's 2004 ABC survey, and the customer's favourite book of the millennium in a 1999 Amazon poll. Tolkien was recognised as the 92nd greatest Briton in a 2002 BBC poll and 35th in the 2004 Great South Africans survey. His popularity extends beyond English-speaking countries, as a 2004 German poll found The Lord of the Rings to be their favourite literature. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe for more content.